Imagine being one of the most respected warriors in your nation, a man anointed to be king, now reduced to a fugitive, hunted like an animal by the very ruler you once served. David's heart pounds as he flees from King Saul, running out of places to hide, with death seemingly at every turn. Desperate and cornered, he makes a shocking decision, one that will either save him or seal his fate. But would you, a future king, dare to abandon all dignity, to save your life in the most humiliating way possible? What drove David to such a drastic choice, and how far would you go when survival is at stake? As David steps into enemy territory, his past catches up with him. He stands face to face with the very people he once defeated in battle, the Philistines. Recognized and surrounded by danger, David feels the walls closing in. In a moment of unimaginable tension, he crafts a plan so outrageous, so unexpected, that it leaves everyone stunned. But can this future king truly escape death by pretending to lose his mind? The suspense builds as David teeters on the brink of life and death, and his next move will define his destiny. What would you do if your life depended on convincing your enemies that you had gone mad? David had served King Saul faithfully, leading Israel to victory and playing music to soothe the troubled king. But now, the same king who once welcomed him into his palace sought his life with a vengeance. David had become a fugitive, running from a man consumed by jealousy and rage. Every day brought a new level of danger, and David found himself constantly looking over his shoulder. What do you do when those you once trusted turn against you? David was about to find out. As David fled, the reality of his situation set in. He was no longer a beloved servant of the king. He was a wanted man, hunted like an animal. The intensity of the fear weighed heavily on him. His once secure world had shattered, and he had no idea where to turn. Saul had resources and soldiers, while David had nothing but his wits and faith in God. How long could he survive? Every step he took felt like a step closer to his death. David's journey as a fugitive wasn't just a physical escape, it was an emotional and spiritual battle. The man who had slain Goliath with confidence now felt small and vulnerable. The constant threat of death overshadowed his every move. But beneath that fear, there was something deeper, a trust in God's promises. David had been anointed as the future king of Israel, and though his current situation seemed bleak, he clung to the belief that God had a plan. The wilderness became David's home, and survival became his priority. He moved from place to place, avoiding Saul's men, always staying one step ahead. But how long could this last? The tension was unbearable. David's heart ached for peace, yet every corner he turned seemed to bring more danger. Saul's wrath was relentless, and David knew he needed more than just human ingenuity to stay alive. Would God intervene before it was too late? David's men remained loyal, though they were just as weary as he was. Together they formed a band of outcasts, united by their shared need to escape Saul's wrath. But loyalty wasn't enough to guarantee survival. They needed a plan, a safe place to hide. David's mind raced with possibilities, but none seemed promising. The walls were closing in, and he knew he had to make a bold move. The question was, where could he go that Saul wouldn't follow? As the days passed, David's desperation grew. He needed to find refuge, but the options were limited. Returning to Israel was out of the question, as Saul's influence was too widespread. David realized he would need to seek safety in the most unlikely of places, the land of the Philistines, Israel's sworn enemies. It was a dangerous gamble, but David had no other choice. Sometimes, in our most desperate moments, we're forced to seek refuge in unexpected places. The decision weighed heavily on David. Could he really trust the Philistines, the very people he had fought against? And even if they didn't kill him on sight, how could he live among them without being discovered? The tension between survival and fear gripped his heart. But David had survived this long by trusting in God, and now, more than ever, he would need that trust to guide him. The next step he took would change everything. Finally, David made his decision. He and his men would head to Gath, the city of King Achish, one of the most powerful Philistine leaders. It was a dangerous choice, but David believed it was his only chance. As they approached the gates of the city, David's heart raced. Would they be recognized? Could they find refuge in the land of their enemies? The desperation in David's heart was matched only by his faith that somehow God would see him through. As David and his men entered the Philistine city of Gath, the tension was palpable. Gath was home to the Philistines, Israel's sworn enemies, and David had killed their champion, Goliath. The risk was enormous. Every face in the crowd seemed to recognize him. Every whisper carried his name. How long could he go unnoticed? Entering enemy territory was a gamble, but David was desperate for refuge, even if it meant seeking it among those who had reason to hate him. The irony of the situation was not lost on David. The very people he had fought against were now his potential saviors. But this was no peaceful negotiation. David's life hung in the balance. The tension between survival and the ever-present danger of being recognized gnawed at his mind. What would happen if they found out who he truly was? Would King Achish offer him protection, or would he deliver him to Saul as a political favor? David's heart raced as he walked through the streets of Gath. He felt the weight of every stare, every murmur. The people of Gath knew who he was. There was no denying that. He had stood in battle against them, led Israel's armies, and now he stood alone, vulnerable in the heart of enemy territory. Every step he took felt like walking on the edge of a blade, with his enemies all around. But David kept moving forward, trusting that God had a plan. The decision to seek refuge among the Philistines was a bold one, but it was also a dangerous one. David had no idea how the king would react to his presence. Would Achish see him as a threat, or as an opportunity? The weight of uncertainty pressed down on David. He had escaped Saul, but was he walking into another trap? The risk was enormous, but David had no other options. This was his last hope, and he prayed it would be enough. As David approached the palace of King Achish, his mind raced with possibilities. Would the king recognize him as the hero of Israel? Would he be treated as an enemy or a guest? The tension in the air was thick, and David's heart pounded with every step. His fate was no longer in his hands. He had put himself at the mercy of the very people he had once fought against. Would they spare him, or would they see him as a threat? The guards led David into the palace, where King Achish awaited. The room was filled with tension, and David could feel the eyes of the court on him. This was the moment of truth. His reputation as a warrior preceded him, and there was no hiding from his past. The king's advisors whispered among themselves, recognizing the man who had slain Goliath. David's heart raced. Would his enemies show mercy, or would this be the end of his journey? As the whispers grew louder, David knew he had to act quickly. His life was in danger, and the king's decision could come at any moment. The people of Gath recognized him as the one who had humiliated their armies, and David could see the hatred in their eyes. He had to find a way out, and he had to do it fast. Survival instincts kicked in, and David began to hatch a desperate plan. But would it work? David's heart pounded as he realized that escape might be his only option. But how could he escape from the heart of enemy territory without being captured? Desperation set in, and David knew he needed to think fast. His only hope was to convince them that he was no threat. And so, in a moment of desperation, David made a decision that would define this chapter of his life. He would pretend to be insane, hoping that his madness would save him. Faced with the imminent threat of death, David made a decision that seemed both desperate and absurd. He would feign insanity. It was a bold move, one that could either save him or seal his fate. He allowed saliva to drip down his beard and began scratching at the doors, acting like a man who had lost his mind. For the future king of Israel, this was a moment of utter humiliation. But in desperation, survival sometimes demands drastic measures. As David scratched at the doors and drooled down his beard, the court of King Achish watched in bewilderment. Could this really be the same David who had led Israel to victory, the man who had slain Goliath? His behavior seemed so far removed from the mighty warrior they had heard of. The image of the brave soldier was replaced by the sight of a raving madman. David's decision to pretend madness was shocking, but it was his only chance to survive. The humiliation of the act was profound. David, the anointed king of Israel, was reduced to pretending he had lost his mind in order to avoid death. His decision to degrade himself in this way must have been agonizing. But in that moment, survival outweighed pride. David knew that sometimes the path to victory requires humility, even to the point of appearing foolish. His madness was not a sign of weakness, but a testament to his resolve to live. David's plan was risky, but it was also brilliant. By pretending to be insane, he positioned himself as harmless in the eyes of King Achish. The Philistines had no reason to fear a madman. They saw him as a pitiful creature, not as the warrior who had once decimated their armies. David's feigned insanity bought him time, keeping him safe from immediate harm. But how long could he keep up the act? And would the king truly believe he had lost his mind? As the court of King Achish watched, David continued his act. He scribbled nonsensical marks on the doors and allowed saliva to pool in his beard. His behavior was erratic, and the once dignified image of David as a warrior and leader faded into that of a pitiful madman. The tension in the room shifted from suspicion to confusion. Was this really the man they had feared? David's performance was convincing, but his heart raced with uncertainty. Would they fall for it? The decision to pretend madness wasn't just about escaping immediate danger. It was a psychological tactic. By acting insane, David threw his enemies off balance. They didn't know what to make of him. Was he truly mad? Or was this some elaborate ruse? The confusion in the court worked in David's favor. King Achish's advisors began to murmur, debating what to do with the man before them. David's gamble was paying off, but the outcome was still uncertain. In pretending to be mad, David was forced to confront his own vulnerability. This was a man who had faced giants, led armies, and been anointed as king, yet here he was, acting like a fool to save his life. It was a humbling moment, but it was also a testament to David's resourcefulness. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a survivor. And in this moment, survival required him to abandon his pride and embrace the role of a madman. The tension in the room reached its peak as King Ash observed David's behavior. Would the king be convinced by the act, or would he see through it? David's heart pounded in his chest as he scratched at the door, waiting for the king's response. His life hung in the balance, and everything depended on whether or not the king believed he was truly mad. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to the king. Pretending to be mad took a toll on David's spirit. As he scratched at the doors and drooled down his beard, he felt the weight of his actions pressing on his soul. He had been anointed as the future king of Israel, yet here he was, reduced to acting like a fool in front of his enemies. The emotional impact of this decision was immense. How had it come to this? David had faced giants, led armies, and now he was pretending to be insane. The humiliation of the moment was overwhelming. David, once revered as a hero, was now seen as a pitiful madman. But beneath the surface of this degrading act, David's faith remained intact. He had been placed in an impossible situation, and this was the only way out. In pretending to be insane, David was not giving up on God's promises. He was doing what he had to do to survive. Sometimes, survival requires us to take paths we never imagined. David's emotional turmoil was palpable. He knew that his actions were necessary, but they weighed heavily on him. The future king of Israel had been reduced to madness, not because he had lost faith, but because he was determined to stay alive. The decision to act insane was born out of desperation. But it was also an act of faith. David believed that God still had a plan for him, even if that plan involved pretending to be something he was not. As David continued his act, the weight of his situation pressed on him. He was in the heart of enemy territory, surrounded by those who hated him, and the only thing keeping him alive was the illusion of madness. It was a humbling experience, but David knew that humility was often the path to survival. He had learned to trust in God's provision, even in the most humiliating circumstances. In this moment, David's faith in God's plan was his only comfort. The emotional toll of pretending to be mad was immense, but David refused to let it break him. He had been through too much to give up now. The same man who had stood before Goliath with nothing but a sling and a stone now stood before his enemies, armed only with his wits and his faith. It was a different kind of battle, but the stakes were just as high. David knew that he had to trust in God, even when his circumstances seemed impossible. David's act of madness was not just about survival, it was about maintaining his faith in God's promises. He had been anointed as king, but that promise had not yet been fulfilled. David's current situation seemed far removed from the throne of Israel, but he trusted that God's plan was still in motion. Pretending to be insane was a temporary solution, a means of staying alive until God's promises could be fulfilled. David's faith in God's plan never wavered, even in his madness. As the days passed, David continued his act. The emotional strain was immense, but he refused to let it defeat him. He knew that God had brought him this far, and he believed that God would see him through. The act of pretending to be mad was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but David clung to his faith. He had survived countless battles, and he believed that he would survive this one too. His trust in God remained unshaken. Living in madness was not easy, but it was necessary. David's decision to feign insanity was a testament to his resourcefulness and determination. He had chosen to live, even if it meant humiliating himself in front of his enemies. The emotional impact of this decision was profound, but David's faith in God's plan gave him the strength to endure. As he continued his act, David knew that this was not the end of his story. It was just one more chapter in his journey of faith. King Achish watched as David continued his bizarre behavior. The king's advisors had whispered about David's reputation, but what they saw before them now didn't match the stories they had heard. This was not the fearless warrior who had defeated Goliath. This was a madman, scribbling on doors and drooling on himself. Achish, perplexed by the sight, questioned whether this was truly the same man who had led Israel to victory. The sight of David's apparent insanity left the court baffled. As the moments passed, Achish's suspicion turned to dismissal. "Do I lack madmen?" he asked in frustration. "Why bring this fellow to me?" To the king, David was no longer a threat. He was just another lunatic, not worth his time or attention. The decision to ignore David and let him go was swift. Achish had no interest in keeping a madman in his court, especially one as pitiful as David appeared to be. The king's reaction played perfectly into David's plan. David's act of madness had worked. By pretending to be insane, he had convinced the king that he was no longer a danger. In the eyes of Achish and his court, David was harmless, pitiful, and not worth the trouble. The deception had saved David's life. As the king ordered him to be left alone, David breathed a sigh of relief. His gamble had paid off, and he had bought himself precious time. But the emotional toll of the act lingered. Achish's reaction to David's madness was a testament to how effective David's plan had been. The king, who might have otherwise seen David as a political threat or a bargaining chip, now saw him as a nuisance. The court's whispers of fear and admiration had turned into murmurs of pity. David's act had stripped away the perception of him as a powerful leader, leaving only the image of a broken, unstable man. But for David, this was exactly what he needed. David had survived the encounter with King Achish, but at what cost? His dignity had been sacrificed, and his reputation had been tarnished. Yet in that moment, survival was all that mattered. David's decision to feign madness had saved him from certain death, and he was now free to escape. As Achish dismissed him, David's heart was filled with both relief and sorrow. He had lived to see another day, but the experience had left him humbled and broken. Achish's decision to dismiss David marked a turning point in the story. The king had been deceived, and David had successfully escaped the danger that had surrounded him. But the question remained, how long could David keep this up? His act of madness had worked for now, but he couldn't rely on it forever. The experience had shaken him to his core, and he knew that he would need to continue trusting in God's guidance if he was to survive the trials ahead. For King Achish, David was no longer a concern. The once feared warrior was now a pitiful madman, not worth the effort of pursuing. Achish's dismissal of David was swift, and the king turned his attention to other matters. In the eyes of the Philistines, David had become a non-threat, a man who had lost his mind. The king's decision to let him go without harm was a victory for David, but it was also a reminder of the fragility of his situation. As David walked away from the court of King Achish, he felt the weight of his decision. He had escaped, but the cost had been high. His reputation had been shattered, and his pride had been wounded. Yet, in that moment, survival was all that mattered. David had lived to fight another day, and for that, he was grateful. As he left the palace, he prayed for guidance, knowing that his journey was far from over. David's escape from the Philistines was nothing short of miraculous. The man who had once stood tall as a warrior and future king had been reduced to feigning madness, but the plan had worked. As he left Gath behind, David breathed a deep sigh of relief. The desperation that had led him to act insane had saved his life, but it was his faith in God that had truly carried him through. He knew that without God's protection, he wouldn't have survived. As David reflected on his escape, he couldn't help but see God's hand at work. The act of madness had been his own desperate idea, but it was God who had given him the wisdom and courage to carry it out. David's faith, though tested by the extreme circumstances, had remained intact. He had trusted that God would guide him, even in the midst of his most humiliating moments. His survival wasn't just a result of his cleverness, it was a testament to God's faithfulness. David's escape from Gath was more than just a physical escape, it was a spiritual victory. In pretending to be mad, David had humbled himself to the lowest point, yet in doing so, he had placed his trust in God's plan. The experience had tested his faith, but it had also strengthened it. David realized that sometimes God's deliverance comes in unexpected ways. The very act that seemed to degrade him had, in fact, been the means of his salvation. As David made his way to safety, his heart was filled with gratitude. He had escaped death, and he knew that it was only by God's grace that he had survived. The desperation that had driven him to Gath had been transformed into a deep sense of reliance on God. David's faith had carried him through the darkest of times, and now, as he walked away from his enemies, he knew that God's promises were still true. He was still the anointed king, and his journey was far from over. David's escape was a reminder of the power of faith in desperate times. He had faced insurmountable odds, yet he had survived by trusting in God. His plan to pretend madness had been born out of fear, but it had been carried out with faith. David knew that survival sometimes requires us to humble ourselves and trust in God's provision, even when the path seems foolish. His escape from Gath was not just a victory over his enemies, it was a victory of faith. The experience in Gath left David with a profound sense of humility. He had been brought low, yet God had lifted him up. In his most desperate hour, David had turned to God for guidance, and God had delivered him. The escape from Gath was a turning point in David's life, a moment when he realized that his survival depended not on his strength or cleverness, but on his faith in God. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As David continued his journey, he reflected on the events in Gath. He had faced death, humiliation, and uncertainty, but through it all, he had trusted in God. The act of pretending madness had saved him, but it was his faith that had truly carried him through. David knew that his journey was far from over and that more challenges lay ahead. But he also knew that with God by his side, he could face whatever came next. David's escape from Gath was a testament to the power of faith in times of desperation. He had been brought to the edge, yet he had survived by trusting in God's plan. The experience had humbled him, but it had also strengthened his resolve. David knew that his future as king was still uncertain, but he also knew that God was faithful. As he walked away from the Philistines, David prayed for continued guidance, trusting that God would lead him through the challenges ahead. David's experience in Gath taught him profound lessons about humility and survival. The future king of Israel had been reduced to pretending madness in order to escape death. But through it all, he had learned that sometimes, survival requires us to abandon our pride. David's decision to act insane was not a sign of weakness, it was a testament to his resourcefulness and his willingness to do whatever it took to stay alive. In humility, David found the strength to survive. The experience of pretending madness humbled David in ways he hadn't expected. As a man who had been anointed as king, it must have been difficult to lower himself to such a humiliating act. But in that moment, David realized that survival was more important than pride. The lesson was clear. Sometimes, God calls us to humble ourselves in order to live. David's experience in Gath became a powerful reminder that humility is often the key to victory. David's survival in Gath wasn't just a result of his cleverness, it was a result of his humility. By pretending to be mad, he had acknowledged his vulnerability and his need for God's guidance. The experience was a humbling one, but it was also a testament to David's willingness to trust in God's plan, even when it required him to act in ways that seemed foolish. The lesson of humility stayed with David, shaping his understanding of what it meant to be a leader. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on David. He had once been a mighty warrior, revered for his strength and bravery. Yet here he was, pretending to be insane to survive. But in that moment, David realized that true strength isn't always about physical power. It's about wisdom, humility, and the ability to adapt to difficult circumstances. The experience in Gath was a reminder that God's path for us often requires humility, even when it seems undignified. As David reflected on his time in Gath, he understood that humility was not a sign of weakness, but of strength. By humbling himself and pretending madness, he had saved his life and lived to fight another day. The lesson of humility was one that David would carry with him as he continued his journey toward the throne. God had called him to be a leader, but he had also called him to be humble. The two were not mutually exclusive, they were intertwined. The act of pretending madness had humbled David, but it had also strengthened him. He had learned that survival sometimes requires us to set aside our pride and trust in God's plan. The experience in Gath had shaped David's understanding of what it meant to be a leader. A true leader is not just someone who stands tall in victory, but someone who is willing to humble themselves in order to survive. David's time in Gath was a powerful lesson in leadership. David's experience in Gath wasn't just about escaping death, it was about learning to trust in God's provision, even when the path seemed humiliating. Pretending madness had been a desperate move, but it had saved his life. The lesson of humility was one that David would carry with him as he continued his journey. He had learned that survival sometimes requires us to humble ourselves before God, trusting that He will guide us through even the most difficult circumstances. As David moved forward, the lessons of Gath remained with him. He had survived by humbling himself, by pretending madness, and by trusting in God's plan. The experience had shaped his understanding of what it meant to be a leader, a survivor, and a man of faith. Humility, David realized, was not a weakness, it was a strength. And as he continued his journey toward the throne, he knew that God would continue to guide him, just as he had in Gath. David's story challenges us to reflect on how we respond to desperation in our own lives. When we find ourselves cornered, with no way out, how do we react? David's decision to pretend madness was born out of desperation, but it was also a testament to his resourcefulness and faith. His story reminds us that sometimes, survival requires us to take paths we never imagined. When faced with impossible situations, how willing are we to humble ourselves and trust in God's plan? David's experience in Gath teaches us that even in the darkest moments, there is always a way forward. The key is to trust in God, even when the path seems humiliating or foolish. David's decision to pretend madness was not a sign of defeat, it was a strategic move that saved his life. In the same way, we are called to trust in God's guidance, even when it leads us down unexpected paths. Desperation can be a powerful catalyst for faith. The story of David's escape from Gath reminds us that survival often requires humility. David's willingness to abandon his pride and act insane saved his life, and his story encourages us to reflect on the role of humility in our own lives. How often do we allow pride to get in the way of our survival or our relationship with God? David's story challenges us to let go of our pride and embrace humility as a means of survival and spiritual growth. David's experience also highlights the importance of faith in times of desperation. Even when he was forced to pretend madness, David never lost his faith in God's plan. His story reminds us that faith is not just about trusting God when things are going well. It's about trusting Him in the midst of desperation, when everything seems to be falling apart. David's faith carried him through his darkest moments, and his story inspires us to hold on to our faith, even in the face of adversity. As we reflect on David's journey, we are reminded that survival sometimes requires us to make difficult choices. David's decision to pretend madness was a drastic move, but it was necessary for his survival. His story encourages us to consider how we handle desperate situations in our own lives. Are we willing to take bold, unexpected steps to survive, or do we let fear and pride hold us back? David's story challenges us to embrace creativity and humility in the face of adversity. David's escape from Gath also reminds us that God's guidance often comes in unexpected ways. The path to survival may not always be clear or dignified, but God's hand is always at work. David's decision to pretend madness was not just a result of his own ingenuity, it was a result of his faith in God's provision. His story challenges us to trust in God's plan, even when it seems unconventional. In moments of desperation, we are called to lean on God for guidance and strength. David's story encourages us to reflect on the balance between action and faith. While David took bold action to survive, he also trusted in God's plan. His story reminds us that faith is not passive. It requires us to act, to make decisions, and to trust that God is with us every step of the way. Desperation may push us to take drastic measures, but David's story shows us that when we act in faith, God will guide us through even the most difficult circumstances. In the end, David's story is a testament to the power of faith, humility, and survival. His willingness to humble himself and pretend madness saved his life, but it was his faith in God that truly carried him through. As we face our own moments of desperation, we are called to trust in God's plan, even when it seems unclear. David's journey encourages us to embrace humility, to take bold steps of faith, and to trust that God will guide us through the darkest of times. Imagine being one of the most respected warriors in your nation, a man anointed to be king, now reduced to a fugitive, hunted like an animal by the very ruler you once served. David's heart pounds as he flees from King Saul, running out of places to hide, with death seemingly at every turn. Desperate and cornered, he makes a shocking decision, one that will either save him or seal his fate. But would you, a future king, dare to abandon all dignity, to save your life in the most humiliating way possible? What drove David to such a drastic choice, and how far would you go when survival is at stake? As David steps into enemy territory, his past catches up with him. He stands face to face with the very people he once defeated in battle, the Philistines. Recognized and surrounded by danger, David feels the walls closing in. In a moment of unimaginable tension, he crafts a plan so outrageous, so unexpected, that it leaves everyone stunned. But can this future king truly escape death by pretending to lose his mind? The suspense builds as David teeters on the brink of life and death, and his next move will define his destiny. What would you do if your life depended on convincing your enemies that you had gone mad?